Hello everybody and welcome back to another AP Biology video. In this video, we are going to cover community interactions and touch on biodiversity. This video will cover topics 8.5, 8.6, and 8.7 if you're following along in the AP Biology CED or course and exam description pages. And it touches on most of the topics that are covered in the Biology in Focus, Chapter 41. And in this video, we are going to hit on a lot of the things that causes individuals to interact with members of different populations. So we are dealing at the community level of ecological organization. And the importance of biodiversity, so increasing the types of organisms that we see within a community and the effects that it has overall on ecosystem function. So if you guys are ready, we'll go ahead and get into it. Starting off, just in case we need a little bit of a refresher, remember that we organize ecological levels dependent on the number and types of species that exist within those ecosystems. And so when we're dealing with community level organization, we are dealing with populations of different species that live within the same area. Where a population dealt exclusively with one species at a time, community takes those populations and combines them together. Because nothing exists in a microcosm. Everything can coexist and interact within a common space. And so we're going to see that a lot of these interactions that are exhibited between different populations, different species within the same area, these can either be beneficial to organisms or they can ultimately harm those organisms. And we're going to talk about some of those different examples that fall under that umbrella of what we term community interactions. We're going to start with just a general definition of interspecific interactions. So this is another one of those terms that has a scientific root attached to it. When we talk about something being inter, like internet, we are talking about connections between different things. So it is an interaction that exists between different species that exist within this community. And as ecologists, we are going to define these types of interactions based on the type of effect that they're having within that interaction. So what can be positive to one species can be negative to another. So the three main categories that we identify interactions as include competition. Here we're going to look specifically at interspecific competition, but there is intra-specific competition where we have competition between members of the same species. This can often be for resources, territory, mates, all those sort of things. That falls under the umbrella of intra-specific competition. We're going to look specifically today at different species, so inter-specific competition. We will also be looking at consumer resource interactions. We're actually going to save all of our lovely food webs and food chains for the next video, but we do understand that individuals have to get their energy from somewhere. So whether you are eating or being eaten, you fall into this consumer resource category. And then the one that I think is most commonly considered when we look at interactions between members of a community are symbioses. That is the plural for the term symbiosis, and those are going to be our kind of unique interactions. Those are interactions where individuals are living in close proximity to each other, really affecting each other on a daily basis. So we will start with competition. Competition is usually negative for both species, but what we will see when species compete, just like if you compete in a sport or other sort of activity, that there's always going to be a winner out of that competition. So when we have a resource that is limiting, be that space or a nutrition resource or something that limits the reproduction of a particular species, we're going to see competition. Everyone wants to be able to survive in a given environment, and the level of interaction that we see is often dependent on space. So we have this principle, the principle of competitive exclusion. When we have two species, so two separate populations competing for the same resource, they're not going to be able to permanently coexist. One organism will win and the other one will lose. And in this case, losing will mean that we will either die, have to move to a different area, or in an ultimate cause, we can go extinct. So what we see with competitive exclusion is that we have an elimination of a particular competitor. So whoever is less adapted to this environment, they will often be the loser in this situation. A really great example that's often discussed in textbooks are these bacteria species, Aurelia and Caudatum, and when they live in isolation, both thrive within a just general environment. But when we place them in the same system, when they have to compete for nutrition, for resources, for space, we see that Aurelia tends to be the victor, and we will see the elimination of Caudatum in that species. So Aurelia, being better adapted for this particular environment, has the advantage, and that's going to lead to the elimination or the death of our Caudatum population. And this all really comes down to what we term as an ecological niche. So if habitat is where you live, the niche is how you live. It's the job. It is how you acquire your resources. And we can categorize niches based on whether or not a population has the potential to occupy that niche. So we could all live in a variety of different environments, but some environments may be better suited to a lack of competition. So the fundamental niche is the environment that we could potentially occupy. So we have all of these different possibilities, these potential ecosystems that we could exist in, but we are talking just in isolation in that case. When we deal with competitive exclusion, we often see that organisms will fall into what we call a realized niche. So this is the reality of the situation. It is limited because other competing species are present. So we may have this one space that's ours. We could have more, but due to competition, we are more limited in our acquisition of those resources and that space. So what often happens when we've got species that are competing for the same habitat, the same niche, so everyone has the same fundamental niche, then we will see what we call resource partitioning. And resource partitioning is essentially the establishment of those realized niches where we have several populations that could exist in those fundamental niches, but they instead section off portions of the environment in which they're living so that everyone can survive. This ultimately derives down to what is easiest for survival. One really great example that the book goes into is that of barnacles. So you can see in this figure that we have two different species of barnacles, one that has a lower fundamental niche in terms of the water level, and the other that has a slightly higher fundamental niche. Where we see overlap, that's where competition is going to occur. So species will tend not to exist in those competitive environments and instead shift into those realized niches where we limit the amount of interaction or competition that we may see. On a slightly easier note, competition being that negative interaction between species, consumer resource, we start to see the positives that can come with interactions. Everybody has to eat. So whether we are eating or being eaten, consumer resource is going to be beneficial for whatever is doing the eating and negative for whatever is being eaten. And we can classify consumer resource interactions into two separate categories based on the level of trophic interaction we're dealing with. So are we consumers or are we, primary consumers or are we secondary consumers? Predation is where a secondary or tertiary consumer consumes a primary or secondary consumer via versus herbivory, which is our primary consumers eating our producers. So we're still seeing a negative effect on whatever's being eaten, but a positive effect because we're acquiring resources in whatever is doing the eating. And finally, the last interaction that we are going to highlight in this presentation is that of symbioses. Symbioses can fall into a couple of different categories. We classify them based on the really results of that interaction between species. The three main ones, there are more, but the three main ones that we are going to see are parasitism. Parasitism is beneficial to our parasite, which can either be internal or external, and these are organisms that derive nourishment from their host, which can be harmed in the process, but it's not very beneficial for our host to die in the process, which is what separates this from a consumer resource type of interaction. So we want the host to stay alive because that is our source of food. And so a parasite will feed off of a host. The parasite benefits. The host will see some detriment in this situation. They are being harmed. And ultimately, we see that parasites usually have a specific host that they prefer. You guys may be familiar with things like ticks or leeches or some tapeworms when we consider internal parasites. On a brighter note, when we have a mutually beneficial relationship, we have a mutualism. One of my favorite examples of a mutualism, because everyone's seen Finding Nemo, we have the clownfish and the sea anemone, and they have a mutual beneficial relationship where the anemone gives our clownfish a environment in which to live, a protective environment, and the clownfish does a lot of work in cleaning the anemone, so we have some waste disposal there. The final type of symbiosis that we are going to highlight here is commensalism. Commensalism is highlighted because we have a null relationship or outcome for one of the individuals involved, where mutualism is mutually beneficial and parasitism can damage one of the individuals. Commensalism does not either benefit or harm the secondary individual involved. This often shows up with our species that are kind of cleaners in the ecosystem. So you have a lot of different fish species that will attach to larger species and consume some of the dead skin and detritus coming off of those individuals. And so whoever is eating all of that detritus, they're benefiting from the relationship, but we don't see any impact on the primary I don't want to say host in this situation because that really does determine parasitism, but whoever is kind of letting them consume off of their person. Now, communities have this rich biodiversity that leads to these interactions. And when we look at different communities, they will differ based on the diversity of species that exist within that community and the trophic relationships that we have therein. Now, species diversity is extremely important. More diverse communities will be more withstanding to disturbances that may exist. So things like wildfires, catastrophic events. These are things that are really more harmful to species that are limited in their diversity. So when we look at species diversity, we're going to look at two major pieces. We have species richness, which is the number of different species that we have, and then those species relative abundance, so the proportion that they make up of the particular whole. And one of the equations that we will see on our biology equations and formulas sheet is that of Simpson's diversity index. This is a simplified diversity index, so there are different versions of this index that are available depending on what type of a community we're looking at and what level we are looking at. This is the simplified version overall. When we look at this type of equation, some of the things that we're going to want to highlight, the fact that we have that Greek sigma. Sigma means sum. So we are adding together everything that's coming after the sigma in this case, and n representing the number of individuals of a particular species, that lowercase n, and the uppercase n being the total number in our population. We've seen capital N show up previously in our population growth equations. So for this particular diversity index, we would take the number of a particular individual and we would divide it by the total number of individuals within our population. We would square that. And after we have done that for all of the species that exist within this community, and we add them together, we take one, we subtract that sum, and that gives us our diversity index. Lower diversity indices will be a more species diverse community, whereas higher will mean that we have less diversity, and it may mean that our community is more potentially devastated by some of our more extreme events or disturbances. So I'm actually going to ask you guys to calculate Simpson's diversity index for this particular community of trees. So we have different species, species A, B, C, and D, that all make up different proportions of this community. For this piece, use the Simpson's diversity index that you have on the formula sheet. I should have provided you with a table to help organize your calculations, but if I didn't, I am so sorry. For this particular piece, I've not often seen on the AP exam them requiring you to calculate this in full, but it is good practice. So take some time, write down your answers on your sheet, and we will be back at it here soon. Okay, welcome back everybody. Let's see how we did. So for this particular example, I already provided you with the proportion of our individuals within this particular community. So those percentages that we have, if we convert those to decimals, that takes care of our initial calculations for the proportion within this community. And all we really have to do is square and then sum. So if we square and then sum, we find that the sum of our diversity is approximately 0.25. And the piece that a lot of people forget about is that we do have to subtract that from 1. So that ends up giving us a diversity index of 0.75. So we do have a lower species diversity within this community as compared to the one that I showed you previously. Hopefully that equation wasn't too difficult. As long as you guys feel comfortable kind of following the process, you should have done just fine on that one. So why is diversity important again? Well, diversity is correlated to how resilient our community is. So resilience is what we define as the ability of an ecosystem to absorb change and return to a same equilibrium state after a temporary disturbance. So disturbances happen all the time, and in ecosystems, these are very natural. We expect ecosystems to change. The earth changes throughout the year, and sometimes it needs to change slightly more. So like controlled forest fires are often something that we see as a temporary disturbance. If we were to leave ecosystems alone and humans were not to exist, we would actually see wildfires happen on a fairly regular basis, not like they do now, but this would allow the kind of rebirth of our ecosystem. And so we want our communities to be diverse. The more biodiversity we see, the more resilient our community is, and the more likely it is that those species will continue to be able to exist within that particular ecosystem. And the roles that our species play within our environments are often extremely influential to the overall dynamics of our community. So a couple to highlight, I'm really going to spend more time with the keystone species, and different species within our community are going to play different roles. They have different niches, and some have a stronger pull on the community itself. So these are species that we want to make sure that we are able to conserve overall. So we'll start with the keystone species. I'll highlight the keystone species a little bit more on the next slide. But keystone species play a large role in the functioning of our ecosystem as a whole. They usually are going to be towards the top to middle of our food chains and food webs, and they really have a lot of hands in a lot of different systems. And the loss of these species can be particularly detrimental to different environments. If we compare keystone species to our dominant species or ecosystem engineers, these play less of a role. Dominant species are what we are going to consider populations that have a large proportion within a particular environment, and so they don't play as influential a role, but being a primary population within an ecosystem, they are of course going to play a role. So they are also important in our overall understanding of how our communities function. And then we've got things like ecosystem engineers. You may think of an engineer as being someone who builds something, whether that be infrastructure or systems. And our ecosystem engineers, very similarly, kind of change the ecosystem that they live in. A good example here being beavers, who are able to kind of change the demographics and landscape that they exist in. I told you I wanted to highlight the keystone species. Keystone species are extremely important because they play such an important role within their community. These are named after the part of an arc called the keystone. The keystone is the center stone within the arc, and it prevents the arc from falling. Without the keystone, the arc does not withstand change. So when we see the removal of a keystone species, this has a great effect on the overall population. And because they're consuming things, and what they're consuming is consuming things, we can see that ripple effect throughout the entire trophic system. So for example, here we have a keystone species example being a a shark, which eats cow nose rays. So by limiting the population of the cow nose rays, we ensure that the populations of bivalves and arthropods are limited as well. If we do not have a limiting factor like the shark on the cow nose rays, they lead to overpopulation, which means that they are going to seek more resources, and that's going to lead to a decrease in whatever they are consuming. So in this case, the bivalves, arthropods, and this will have kind of an up and down effect as time progresses. The last major piece that we are going to hit in this presentation is that of disturbances. Disturbances are something that changes the makeup of our ecosystems. These can be things like storms, fire, human activity. So we are not immune to this. We often create many disturbances throughout our time. And these are anything that causes our ecosystem to exhibit a removal of our organisms or an alteration of the resources that are available. Some of the major effects of disturbances is that we're often left with environments that look nothing like what we had before. And individuals that progress through ecosystems and live in these ecosystems, they are very good at rebounding. So we have this term called ecological succession, and this is a sequential change. So like succession, you have a succession in the monarchy. So we have a changing of the guard, so to speak, that we see that different species move into areas at different times until we reach the same type of community that we would have seen. We do categorize succession into two different camps based on whether or not an ecosystem existed previously. Primary succession being where we have not had a community before, usually something like the aftermath of a volcanic eruption or what we have left over after a glacier. So we really have to break down a lot of that rock. Some lichens are great at that. They are one of our foundational species, what we call a pioneer, because they are leading the way for other species. Sorry, everybody. I had a slight interruption in the middle of this. So I want to say that I was at the end of discussing primary succession, and I will hit on just at the very end the idea of secondary succession. Secondary succession is a similar case of sequential change that changes the composition of our ecosystem, but this is after something that has removed the previous ecosystem. So secondary is where we're going to see things like fire. And not to be a downer as we get to the end of this presentation, but we as humans are terrible for ecosystems. We are the leading cause of most of our issues when it comes to decreases in biodiversity, which means that we have less resilient populations. And so we see all of these categories. We like the acronym HIPPO, and some scholars will also add in additional things to this acronym, but this is an acronym termed by E.O. Wilson, who is a notable ecologist. And HIPPO stands for H, habitat loss. So when we go through and we clear entire forests for logging operations, or when we increase the size of our cities, we see that habitat loss. I being introduced species, otherwise termed invasive species, when we bring things from one area to another, and those species can have detrimental effects on the species that already existed within that ecosystem. Third, P being pollution. We are really good at creating waste within our environments, and so pollution can lead to the death of many species within an ecosystem. The second P is population growth, specifically human population growth. As we grow in our populations, we move into new areas, we disturb more ecosystems. And finally, O is our over-harvesting, when we collect more resources than we need to, or more than that particular population can withstand. And the one that I have selected to really highlight here is that of introduced species. So these are things that we've moved from where they're from to new places, and because they don't have their native predators or diseases or things that really limit their growth, they can very easily take over an area that they're moved into. Two of the ones that we see most often in this area of the United States are kudzu. Kudzu being a weed that essentially grows crazy fast when it's not inhibited within its environment, and it will envelop houses and buses and everything. I remember when I was on my vacation this year, driving through West Virginia and Tennessee, and seeing just complete sections of landscapes covered in this kudzu. Believe it or not, there is a house underneath the kudzu in this picture. And this grows much faster than people can often deal with. So they kind of just let it swallow up certain things. Another one that we may see is that of zebra mussels. Zebra mussels live in freshwater estuaries, and these are often the reasons why we have to clean boats going from one area to another. We want to make sure that we are not moving these mussels anywhere else. You can see here that they just take over. And so ultimately, the takeaway from this very long-winded, kind of disjointed rant on how our communities function is that our communities are built of many different types of species, all coexisting within this area. They're going to interact with each other, and those interactions play a large role in the functioning of the ecosystem as a whole. Everyone wants to survive, everyone wants to get resources, and sometimes that is at odds with another population. And we can see that communities change over time, and these changes will lead eventually to our cases of natural selection, which we'll hit in greater detail later on in the year. But that being said, I will end it here because I'm at about 33 minutes and I don't want to make this too long. If you have any questions, please leave those for me. I will get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful day. See ya.